Chapter 44. Mind in disarray, but say not that the tender heart is too. I do have a brief content warning. Someone makes a mention of rape. It's only a mention, so nothing happens, but just be warned that that is something that is briefly discussed. Very briefly, though. So just keep yourself safe. Be known that that is there. In that instant, Shilian's eyes bulged. Never in his life had anyone treated him like this. First, no one dared. Second, no one could. However, this person was swift like the devil and had appeared so suddenly that he had no chance to defend himself before he'd been plunged into such a state. Flustered, he thrashed and desperately tried to push the person away. Instead, he only succeeded in choking on large mouthfuls of water, as string after string of bubbles escaped from his mouth like crystal beads. Of course, this was a big mistake underwater. The hand around his waist only tightened, pressing their bodies closer together, and Shilian's struggling hands were firmly folded and crushed against his own chest, trapping them in place. His lips, too, were securely sealed. The kiss deepened, and with it, a breath of cool, gentle air was transferred into his mouth. Completely helpless and at a loss, just as Shilian began to accept his fate, he finally saw the person's face clearly. It was Huacheng. The moment he realized it was Huacheng, he stopped struggling. Innumerable random thoughts popped into his mind, all inappropriate for the time and place, such as, so it was Huacheng? No wonder he's cold. Ghosts don't need to breathe, but he can still transfer air to me? Don't ghosts sink in the water? Huacheng suddenly opened his eye. Staring into that dark eye from such an intimate distance, Shilian froze again, then resumed struggling, his arms flailing like a duck so clumsy it was drowning. Huacheng easily corralled those thrashing limbs, and with his arm still firmly locked around Shilian's waist, Huacheng took him and speedily swam upward. It didn't take long before they broke through the water's surface. The waters were freezing, and the air was likewise, yet Shilian's whole body burned. The moment they surfaced, Shilian wanted to turn his head away, but the cloud of black smoke was still swarming above and watching with predatory attention. When it saw someone emerge, it immediately locked on and flashed forward. Shilian only slightly turned his head away, but Huacheng's hand cradled his head and pressed him back into place. Their lips hadn't separated for a second before they were pressed tightly together once more. Shilian's lips were aching and numb from the kiss, and he felt as if he were about to lose all sense of himself. If this were anyone else, he would have long since stabbed them with his sword. But it just had to be Huacheng. He was so completely at a loss for how to respond that tears threatened to fall. Just then, beyond Huacheng's face, he saw thousands upon millions of silver butterflies break through the water beside them. With a sharp trill, that rain of butterflies shot from the surface like iron pellets, their blade-sharp wings reflecting a chilling glare. Within moments, the child spirit was slashed apart and screaming, and the black smoke dispersed as it tried to flee in all directions. However, the countless butterflies swarmed so thickly that they blotted out the sky, and they easily trapped it within their web of wings. No matter how the spirit rammed and pounded, it couldn't break through. Huacheng's eye never once lifted to regard the sight, and with Shilian in his embrace, he once again dove into the waters. Illustration. After a while, their lips finally parted. Once separated, another stream of air bubbles spewed from Julien's mouth, and Huacheng freed a hand to toss a die. The die spun rapidly in the water. It spun out a strong, whirling current before it finally stilled. Afterward, Huacheng and Julien once again surfaced. This time, the shore was not far away, and Huacheng finally swam over with Julien in his grasp. Who knew what shore it was? There were lights and voices seemingly close, yet also far away. Over the waters behind them, the swarm of butterflies shot into the sky with the cloud of black smoke their captive, flying toward the faint lights in the distance, and leaving the fading trail of the child spirit's wails in their wake. Mom! Shilian and Huacheng climbed ashore and collapsed heavily on the ground to stare at each other. Now Shilian was finally able to take a good look at him. It had in fact only been a few days since they parted ways, but Shilian felt like it had been a long time since they were last in each other's company. Huacheng looked good in different ways every time they met. This time, he seemed older by a couple years. His face had always been handsome, and out of the water, it was even more eye-catching. His locks were exceedingly black, his skin extremely pale, and on the right side of his cheek, A very thin braid with a red string was intricately woven through his hair. For the first time, Shilian realized that Hua Chung's hairline was a subtle widow's peak. It made his face look even more shapely and fine. The black eye patch covering his eye added a murderous aura that muted this elegance, but it balanced his good looks almost perfectly. Hua Chung's brow was knitted, as if he was enduring a most arduous ache. He gasped a few times before he opened his mouth to speak, his voice distinctly lower than before. Your Highness, From the hair on his head to the clothes on his body, Shilian's entire person was dripping with water. His lips were swollen, his eyes vacant. He was dazed for a good moment before he managed to stammer out, I... The ayes were uttered innumerable times, until he randomly blurted, I'm a little hungry. Hua Chung was taken aback. Shilian hadn't yet recovered from the shock. His mind was a jumbled mess. No, I'm a little sleepy. He flipped around and landed on his hands and knees, his back facing Hua Chung. His hands fumbled across the ground like he was searching for something. Behind him, Hua Chung asked, What are you looking for? Subconsciously, it was because Shilian didn't dare look at him. I'm looking for a thing. I'm looking for my bamboo hat, he babbled incoherently. Where's my bamboo hat? If anyone else were watching the scene play out, they would certainly yell, He's done for! He's lost his marbles! But in reality, it was only because Shilian had never experienced something like this, and the shock was too great. You see, he had simply lost control a little. Shilian crawled around on hands and knees as he continued to mumble to himself, shuffling away with his back still facing Hua Chung. I can't find it. I'm leaving now. I'm going home to eat. I need to go collect some scraps. I'm sorry, Hua Chung said. Sensing that the voice behind him was coming closer, Shilian jumped to his feet and cried, I'm leaving now! That was practically a cry for help. Hua Chung hastily said, No! Shilian tried to run, but after only a few steps, his ankle twisted and he fell to the ground. He looked back to see a trail of blood behind him. The needle was now completely, deeply embedded in the bottom of his foot. Hua Chung seized his ankle, his voice alarmed. What's wrong? Shilian immediately tried to pull his leg out of that grip. Nothing! It doesn't hurt at all! It's fine! Hua Chung was slightly angered by this. How can it not hurt? Then his hands moved. He was actually going to remove Shilian's boot. Terrified, Shilian scrambled away again, exclaiming as he crawled, No, there's no need! He kept crawling, trying to scamper off, but Hua Chung held him tightly and stopped him from doing so. The chaos finally caught the attention of everyone else on shore, and in a racket as noisy as the beating of drums and gongs and other hellish clamor, a squawking crowd of who-knew-what kind of weirdos surrounded them. Who goes there? Who dares? Don't you know what this place is? Are you done with life, or did you want to die again? Holy crap, ain't this Chenju? The crowd of ghosts immediately hollered in unison, Good day, your old lordship! Shilian let out a wail in his head, wishing desperately that he could cover his face with his hands. This was Ghost City. There were a number of ghosts in the crowd who he remembered seeing the last time he came by. Shilian even saw a familiar hog's head. He and Hua Chung were surrounded by countless humans and ghosts alike, watching them. They were drenched from head to toe, and Hua Chung still had Shilian's ankle grasped in his hand, not letting go. This was such a shocking scene that it finally snapped Shilian out of his tizzy. Once the crowd of ghosts recognized Hua Chung, they became even more excited, shouting their encouragement. Chenju, are you trying to rape someone? Do you need help? We'll hold them down. Beat it, Hua Chung furiously ordered. The crowds of ghosts hastily beat it. However, even if they had only watched from afar and didn't dare come close, Shilian still wanted to just pass out and end everything. This was because Hua Chung had risen to his feet, bent down, and gently swept Shilian up into his arms to carry. They headed in the direction of Ghost City with a heavy gait. Shilian was still dressed in women's clothing, and he could only be grateful that the pillow was no longer stuffed up his skirts. Otherwise, they would paint an even more frightening picture. But that frightful thought finally brought him completely back to the present. He squirmed a bit in Hua Chung's arms, without success, then cleared his throat softly. Sanlang, I'm sorry. I sort of lost my head just now. How embarrassing. What had just happened had really been a blow too shocking for him to withstand. The word blow was harsh, but after all, that had been his first time. Yet it wasn't entirely because it was his first time. In the many centuries past, there had, of course, been a multitude of gorgeous female ghosts who tried to tempt him with their naked bodies, but Shilian's reaction had never been so embarrassing. So why tonight had he devolved into such a state? He supposed it had to be because the state preceptor had only ever taught him how to defend against the wiles of women, not men. Because of his lack of experience, he'd been swept off his feet. Thinking back on his conduct, Shilian was slightly ashamed and felt that he might have overreacted. Sunlong had meant well, so it was terribly rude of Shilian to respond in such a frightened manner. But Hua Cheng replied, "Nothing of the sort. I was the one who crossed the line and offended Gaga. Sunlong should be the one apologizing." Seeing that he hadn't taken it to heart, Shilian secretly let out a breath of relief. "I was in dire straits and you were only trying to help. It wasn't really a big deal in the first place." "Oh, that's right." Shilian suddenly remembered his mission. "Sunlong, why have you suddenly appeared? Where's that child spirit?" Hua Cheng, however, replied authoritatively, "Treating your wounds comes first." During their exchange, they had arrived at a magnificent building. Shilian looked up to see, hanging upon the entrance, the establishment plaque of Paradise Manor. He was astonished. Had Paradise Manor really been rebuilt so fast after it burned down? It looked exactly the same as the old version, but Shilian's conscience was a guilty one, and he was too embarrassed to ask further. Hua Cheng carried him into the building in his arms and set him down upon a black jade divan. As Shilian sat there, Hua Cheng knelt before him, holding Shilian's injured foot, and inspecting the tiny puncture on the sole, dyed by blood. The position made Shilian uneasy. He cried, "Don't!" and made a move to get down, but Hua Cheng pushed him back and swiftly removed his boot and sock with a steady hand. This leg also happened to be the one with the cursed shackle. The deep, black chain locked around that clean, white ankle made for a powerful contrast. Hua Cheng's eyes only lingered for a moment on that soft ankle before his palm pressed against Shilian's injured foot. "This might hurt a bit," Hua Cheng murmured. "Don't hold it in, Gaga. Say something if it hurts." Shilian trailed off. Before he could finish, he felt Hua Cheng squeeze with a bit of force. Pain crawled up his leg, and he couldn't help but shrink back. Hua Cheng's strength was extremely controlled, and little discomforts of this sort were normally nothing to Shilian. But for some reason, Shilian seemed unable to hide his pain in front of Hua Cheng. Maybe what Hua Cheng told him beforehand had made him try extra hard to endure the pain, and his efforts backfired. Sensing Shilian shrink back, Hua Cheng held his ankle tighter and reassured him with a soft voice. "Don't worry. It'll be over soon. Don't be scared." Shilian shook his head, but Hua Cheng's hands became even gentler. He operated speedily, and when he raised his hand again, the tiny needle had been extracted. "All right, it's done." Shilian focused on the tip of that needle. It shone with a vicious glint. Hua Cheng closed his fingers and crushed it easily into nothing but a small puff of black vapor that dissipated into the air. Seeing this, Shilian put aside his discomfort and commented soberly, "What intense resentment. A typical fetus spirit wouldn't have powers that strong."